Hello, hello. The name is Regis Kilbin, and the game is Hearthstone. And if my voice can survive through this video, we're going to talk about the TGT Budget Paladin today. This is a deck designed for complete beginners to Hearthstone. If you've been playing a little while and have some cards, this deck's really not designed for you. This deck is designed for people who are still brand new to the game, just opened their first few packs, are starting to put together a little bit of arcane dust to craft some cards, and want to get a deck that's relatively viable on the ranked ladder as soon as possible and as affordably as possible. So this deck was designed with a 600 arcane dust limit in mind. Most budget decks will look at like 1500 or 2000 or even 1000 dust to be considered an affordable deck, but the goal here was keeping it under 600 dust. So even with just, maybe eight or 10 packs, you should be able to put together 99% of this list with relative ease, and you'll be able to get started on the ranked ladder right away. Now, this won't take you all the way to legend, but frankly, this is a pretty decent deck, and it's not too far off from some decks that have hit legend as kind of aggressive paladin decks. So I wouldn't be surprised if you could play this deck to rank 10. Maybe if you're really skilled and patient and strategic, you could play this thing all the way up to rank 5. You get a couple lucky win streaks. I think it's possible. I don't think it's likely, but this deck has some bite to it. It's really not bad at all. It can do some really neat things. So, again, if you're moderately experienced to Hearthstone, there's probably no need to listen. If you're brand new and looking to play Paladin and do some cool stuff, then maybe tune in for the next 20 minutes. The goal with this deck in general is going to be playing very aggressively. And what that means is that you want to get cheap minions onto the board as quickly as you can. And you want those minions to be sticky thanks to things like Divine Shield, so that you can buff those minions and trade those minions efficiently in the first few turns until you have a nice little swarming board of 3 or 4 minions that you can continue to buff and push for damage against the enemy opponent. Now, this isn't a face deck where you're always going to go face and try to squeeze out as much damage as possible against your enemy. This is kind of more of an aggro board control deck where you get a lot of minions out early, but you trade them efficiently and smartly so that you have a really nice mid-game presence, and then you finish it off and seal the deal with a few really strong 4 and 5 cost minions that come at just the right moment to overwhelm your opponent and allow you to push for lethal damage with some buffs like Boasting of Kings, weapons like True Silver, and direct damage spells like Hammer of Wrath. So, with that in mind, it's really important that you get the mulligan of this deck right. If you don't get the minions you need in the first few turns, you're not going to be able to start building that board presence. You're not going to be able to clean up the enemy board with any kind of efficiency, and you're going to be playing from behind the entire game while drawing weaker cards. So the first 3 turns are really totally vital to this deck's success. If you whiff on the mulligan and you land a few 4-drops that you can't play on turn 1 or turn 2, God forbid, you'll never come back. You'll lose. It's really important you have a minion on the board, and a decent minion on the board at all times. So in the mulligan phase, there are a few things you want to look for above all else. Your absolute key cards are Argent Squire, Annoyotron, and Shielded Minibot. If you happen to land an Argent Protector or a Light's Justice, you shouldn't throw it away. But anything that's not one of those 1 or 2 cost cards, toss it back and look for these cards instead. Now, the reason you want Argent Squire, Annoyotron, and Shielded Minibot in particular is because those are low-cost minions that all have Divine Shield and allow you to do some pretty nifty things with cards like Blessing of Might and even Shattered Sun Cleric, and certainly with Blessing of Kings. So you can buff those minions and surprise your opponents by trading up into stronger minions. So for instance, if Argent Squire, a 1/1, which is pretty weak, is facing off against a minion with 4 health, like let's say Flame Waker from a mage, a 2/4. There's no way a 1/1 can kill a 2/4. That is, unless you have Blessing of Might, which turns this into a 4/1, which then easily trades into a Flamewaker. So you can really gain some tempo and some value by having the right minions on the board early. If you combo those with Blessing of Kings, suddenly you have a 5/5 with Divine Shield, which is a crazy strong minion that can do insane things and push for tons of damage while your opponent really struggles to remove it as early as turn 3 or 4. So, opening up with those 3 minions will give you a huge advantage in a board to build on. You can follow them up with things like Argent Protector, which give them a shield back. Warhorse Trainer, which is a nice little body and buffs any heroic hero power minions, Silverhand recruits you have on the board. True Silver allows you to clean up in the mid game. And there's a lot of neat things you can do as long as you mulligan well and get these proper minions. So now that you know the mulligan, let's just go card by card and talk about what each of these does and its role in the deck. Light's Justice is really basic. It's kind of the 30th card I slotted into this deck, so it's not vital, but it's just nice. It's 1 mana and 4 damage, which is pretty solid value. So if nothing else, it's 4 damage to the face. It's pretty good against clearing 1 and 2 drops in some cases or popping off Divine Shields, basically serving as your ping in the early game. So it's not bad to play this on turn 1. You can do a lot of cool stuff. In worst case scenario, it's just 4 damage against the enemy's face, which adds up. Blessing of Might is a nice free basic card, much like Light's Justice. So it's great for budget decks. It allows you to really start pumping out damage in the early game on things like an Annoyotron or Argent Squire. If they become 4-attack minions, or maybe even a 5-attack minion on a shielded Minibot, with the Divine Shield, suddenly the opponent has to do a ton of work to clear that minion on turn like 2 or 3. They really have to waste some resources and some tempo to get rid of it because it becomes a serious threat to their life total. So it allows you to pump out damage and force your opponent's hand in a way to play inefficiently and give you a little bit of an early game edge. It can be great for trading up, but primarily here we want to use it for punch in the face. Up next is Argent Squire. This is kind of your prototypical Divine Shield minion. Yes, it's only 1 mana and it only has 1 attack and 1 health. It may not sound like much, but it just sets up everything and gives you that nice sticky body early to play off of for the rest of the game. So don't underestimate the impact of getting this out on turn 1 and controlling the initiative throughout the rest of the game thanks to this one single tiny card. Annoyotron is very similar to Argent Squire. It's just 2 mana instead, so it's a little bit more expensive and comes a tad later, but it also has Taunt, so its utility is kind of dual purposed. Say, for instance, you get an Argent Squire with a Blessing of Might buff, right? And it's a 1 health minion with 4 attack. That's pretty threatening to the enemy opponent, and they might want to trade like a really cheap minion into it just to get rid of it. But a follow-up from Annoyotron can protect your higher value minions and make them harder to kill and allow you to pump out more damage over time. So the taunt here should not be underestimated. You use the taunt wisely, you can protect your really valuable stuff in surprising ways, because this is a very annoying card to get through, thus its name. Argent Protector is just a nice Divine Shield enabler. As a minion itself, a 2/2 for 2 is nothing to brag about, but the fact that it can give it a Divine Shield to any other minion in your deck is really useful. So if you buff something with Boasting of Kings and you want to trade it without killing it, just dropping that Argent Protector to give it that immediately used Divine Shield can save your stronger and more powerful minions for a turn or 2 longer. And you can also just set up an annoying minion that's hard to clear, like putting it on a piloted shredder makes it a total nightmare for the enemy to deal with. They have to get rid of the shield, then they have to burn through the 3 health piloted shredder, and then they have to kill whatever it spawns. So you could be like a 3 for 1 in cards thanks to an Argent Protector. Up next is an Ironbeak Owl. This card is really only in the deck for one reason, and that is to help you get through taunts. Because with this deck, you're going to want to push the enemy's face relatively hard. It's not all about the face, but you do need to do face damage as quickly as you can. And if you've put together a nice board through turn 4 or 5, you've knocked them down to maybe 12 or 15 health already, the last thing you want is for them to drop something like a Sludge Belcher, or if it's a Druid, something like an Ancient of War, that totally stops all your momentum and requires you to trade 4 minions into a taunt to clear it, and then you're left with no board and they still have 12 health to deal with. If Ironbeak Owl hits at the right times in the right scenarios, you can just move right through those taunts, ignore them, and push for that lethal damage. It's a nice card to have kind of in pocket and save it for that moment that you need it. Shielded Minibot is very similar to Argent Squire and Annoyatron in its purpose, but as a 2/2 for 2, it really has the highest value of all those cards, giving it just a little bit more potential on the attack front, and it's very, very good at trading with 1 or 2 drops, or even 3 drops that the enemy might play against you. So it tends to get the most value out of all those early game minions, and it's definitely the best thing to have of all 3 of those. Shattered Sun Cleric is not the perfect card for this kind of deck, but it is a free basic card, so it's not bad. It's a 3/2 body, which is threatening because of its 3 attack. It can really start to add up if they don't deal with it, but more importantly, it does buff other minions with 1 attack and 1 health, so putting it on a shielded Minibot turns it into a very scary 3/3. It can do a lot of efficient trading and damage, and it's pretty good if you happen to have a hero power minion out on turn 2 that's not doing much. You can turn it into a 2/2 that's a little bit more valuable. And that buff really starts to matter. You'll see times when it allows you to trade perfectly or gives you just 1 or 2 extra damage that you need along the course of a longer game. So Shattered Sun Cleric is an easily replaceable card, but does work for being free. Warhorse Trainer is a new card from the Grand Tournament. There aren't too many in this deck, so it's one of the few. This is kind of only in this deck because it's an affordable 3-drop. There aren't really a ton of 3-drops that fit the goals of this deck well. Since it's not a face deck, you don't want to go with something like a Wolf Rider. You want something with a little bit of a body and a potential to absorb buffs that also serves utility, and that's what Warhorse Trainer does. Because if you happen to have a few Silverhand recruits out through the course of a 6 or 7 turn game, it can just make them a little bit more potent for trading or pushing in just a few extra points of damage. And as a 2/4 body, it works pretty well with buffs from Shattered Sun Cleric or Boasting of Kings, or even Boasting of Might. Boasting of Might will turn it into a 5/4, for instance, which is a really solid 4 mana body. So it's good at a base stats level, and it also has just a little bit of extra utility thanks to its buff. So it squeezes its way into this deck, but it could be replaced pretty easily by a more expensive 3 mana card. True Silver Champion is, in my mind, probably the best basic weapon in the game. It's just packed with value for 4 mana. It does 8 total damage and also restores 4 health, but you mostly care about that 8 damage. It really adds up. Whether you use it to clear a minion and set up some pressure from your own board, or whether you just use it to go straight face, it really is going to gain value. It's always a great time to play it, whether it's at turn 4 or at turn 8 when you're desperate for a little bit of extra damage. True Silver Champion is usually the perfect answer. This is pretty much the best card in this set, and it's in this deck, and it's free, so it's in this Paladin deck and pretty much every Paladin deck ever. Boasting of Kings is another free 4 mana card for Paladins. Paladins have a lot of really good free cards, so Paladin's a pretty good place to start if you're a new player. Boasting of Kings gives minions a 4/4 buff, which is a huge thing. You might say, oh, but there are 4 mana minions that have like 5 health and 4 attack, like a Chillwind Yeti, so how is that better? Well, this 4/4 essentially has charge. It's like a 4/4 minion with charge, right? Because it happens instantly. As long as you have a minion on the board, which this deck is designed to do with all of our sticky minions, you're getting a 4/4 charge for 4, which is nuts. And when you can combo it with Divine Shield minions like Shielded Minibot or Argent Squire, you're sometimes getting that 4/4 in health and stats twice. You're getting it with a free attack behind a Divine Shield that trades into a bigger minion, or forcing your opponent to defeat it twice, right? They have to trade maybe 2 minions into it to kill it. So it's really, really good on its own. It's really good when played with this deck as well. Boasting of Kings is pretty core to this deck, but it's only works well if you have a minion on the board. So it's important that you have these early game minions that stick around. The next card is another 4 mana free card, which is Consecration. This is your AoE. It does 2 damage to all enemies. That includes minions and the enemy hero's face. So it can be good to remove a pesky board full of small minions that threaten your own minions, or it can just be good sometimes to dig out that last 2 damage that you need if they're hiding behind a wall of taunts and they're only at a few health. It's going to get value whether it's an area of effect clear or just straight direct damage. Up next is Hammer of Wrath, yet another 4 mana free Paladin card. It's kind of insane how many good 4 mana cards Paladin has that are free. Hammer of Wrath is not probably the best, but it does give this deck one thing it's lacking thus far, which is card draw. You're curving out so low in the first few turns, and sometimes using multiple cards per turn, that you'll find yourself running out of gas around turns 5 or 6. And Hammer of Wrath can be that kind of refiller that clears a minion or even does damage to the enemy's face, and also gives you just 1 or 2 more cards throughout the course of a game to really help you survive into the turn 8 or 9 or 10. If this deck runs much past turn 10, you're not probably going to win, but Hammer of Wrath will often hit at just the right moment to give you exactly what you need. It's also just 3 damage, which adds up in a deck that is playing pretty aggressively and looking to hit the face. And it's 3 damage that can be direct cast on the enemy's face, behind taunt walls, so it's good in that regard as well. I should note that Hammer of Wrath is usually not a card you want to play on turn 4. You'd rather have minions or buffs that kind of consolidate the minions that you already have. This is more of a turn 6 through 8 card that refills your hand and doesn't sacrifice board presence and tempo right when you need it in the mid game, because this deck really has to push in the mid game. You get that early game presence and you really push and pressure on turns 4, 5, and 6 with these kinds of strong minions that we're about to get to. If you have to Hammer of Wrath on turn 4, you're going to be really giving up a lot of board presence and not cementing all that work you've done in the early game. So don't aim for this on turn 4, but if you have to, it's fine. Otherwise, try to get a minion instead. Up next is the strongest card in this deck, and honestly one of the strongest cards in the game that was added with the Grand Tournament. It's kind of crazy how good Murloc Knight is. The art is also incredibly awesome. But Murloc Knight is a 4 mana 3/4, which isn't exciting on its own, but its effect is nuts. When you use your hero power with Murloc Knight on the board, you summon a random Murloc, which means worst case scenario you're going to get a 1/1. In best case scenario you get 2/4 with charge that instantly is buffed by the presence of this card. More often than not you're going to get something useful. Sometimes it's a charging minion that you need. Other times it'll be the war leader that buffs this up to a 5/5. There's just all kinds of cool stuff you can do with Murloc Knight. It's not necessarily a turn 4 play. It's usually safer as a turn 6 play, so that you can use your hero power instantly. The worst thing you can do with Murloc Knight is play it on turn 4 and have it immediately killed by the opponent, because you're not going to get that inspire value. This is not a good minion on its base statistics. It's a good minion thanks to its inspire value. So even though this shows up at the 4 mana slot here in the list, it should really be the last card on the list, because it's kind of a 6 mana card that happens to summon a 1/1 minion and a Murloc along with it. This is kind of your big finisher and late game threat that extends the value of this deck farther than it should. But if you get Murloc Knight, or heaven forbid 2 Murloc Knights out on the board, you're going to do some work and build your board with an insane posse of Murlocs, so have fun with that. Up next is Piloted Treader. This is really your key 4-drop minion. It's just packed with value. Piloted Treader is affordable as a common card. It does so many things so well. It pressures as a 4-attack minion. It's very sticky and hard to deal with. The Death Rattle can do some really neat stuff and extend the value on it even farther. It's just kind of the quintessential sticky 4-drop that fits into aggressive decks really well and helps you round out that mid-game curve. Piloted Treader, if you don't craft it for this deck, you're going to eventually craft it for another deck anyway, so it's really just a good long-term value proposition as far as crafting cards is concerned. And then finally, we're going to finish with Frostwolf Warlord. This is not a card you'll see in very many competitive decks, but it's kind of a staple for me when building budget decks, because it's totally free as a basic card for all players. And it's just a good, strong finisher minion that only costs 5 mana, but can be very powerful in aggressive sticky decks like this. Since you're likely to have 2 to 3 minions on the board at any time, this isn't just a 4-4. Its Battlecry turns it into a 5-5 or 6-6 or maybe even a 7-7. You're super lucky an 8-8, and when you've been swarming the board with these kinds of minions and buffs through the first 4 or 5 turns, Frostwolf Warlord coming down can be the final threat that your opponent has just run out of answers and they just cannot deal with it, and suddenly there's a 7-7 on the board that they have no way to kill, and it pushes for so much damage over a turn or two that the game is completely sealed on its back. So in decks like this, focus on board presence and keeping minions around. Frostwolf Warlord is just a really good value minion that tends to do more than people give it credit for. And that is your 30 card list for the TGT Budget Paladin. I know as a beginner, one thing I always like to keep an eye out for was upgrades. Since this is kind of a beginner deck, there are a few upgrades I've identified that might help you as you build out your card list and start to grow as a Hearthstone player. So I'm going to make just a few recommendations. You'll start to see, as you play this deck, things that fit and replacements you'd like to make and cards that aren't doing as much work as you'd like. And as you learn the cards, those will come to mind on their own, but just a few to get you started down that path. First recommendation I'd make is adding in a Muster for Battle. This is a 3-mana spell that summons 3 1/1 Silverhand Recruits and also equips a Light's Justice, a 1/4 weapon. So I'd go ahead and take out Light's Justice and add in a Muster for Battle. It gives you the weapon, but it also gives you 3 minions at once, which is great for comboing with things like Frostwolf Warlord or your Warhorse Trainer, or even a Shattered Sun Cleric. This card just sets up your board in a lot of cool ways, and it's a pain for opponents to deal with, and it does a ton of work, and it's a staple in pretty much every Paladin deck these days. So it is rare, it's not cheap, it will cost 100 dust to craft, but even squeezing 2 into your deck could be advisable. I'd like to have more weapons than we have in this kind of aggressive Paladin deck, and the reason I don't is because they tend to be expensive. So this would be a good first craft. If you plan on playing Paladin for a long time, it's going to show up often for you, so it won't be a waste of dust. The next card I'd like to recommend is probably one of the best neutral minions in the game, despite being only 2 mana, and that is Knife Juggler. This is a 3/2 that anytime you summon a minion, that means either playing a card or just a minion showing up in any way at all. This will throw a knife that does 1 damage to a random enemy. When you combo a Knife Juggler with something like a Muster for Battle, for instance, or any of these cheap, 1 or 2 mana minions hitting the board often, or your Hero Power, or even the Death Rattle from Paladin Shredder, or the summons from Murloc Knights, it's going to just start throwing knives like crazy. And those knives add up, whether they're hitting the face or clearing minions or pinging off 1 health things that are against you. Knife Jugglers are really good. They scare opponents as they should, and they force inefficient plays. So I would go ahead and take out probably my Shattered Sun Cleric in place for the Knife Juggler. You'll notice it's the same body as a 3/2, and really the effect on Knife Juggler is even better than Shattered Sun Cleric's. So you're saving a mana for a better card. It lowers your curve a little and makes you a bigger threat. And then finally, one other card I'd like to recommend, and that is Divine Favor. This is a spell that draws cards until you have as many in hand as your opponent. One thing I noted with this deck is that we don't have very much card draw. It's really just Hammer of Wrath. So you can run out of gas pretty easily, turn 5 or 6 or so if you've been playing a bunch of 2 mana or 1 mana cards. And Divine Favor allows you to recoup those cards. You can just recoup those cards because your opponent will almost always have more cards than you, because very few decks are going to be more aggressive than this. So they might have 4 or 5 cards in hand. You might only have 1 or 2. Casting Divine Favor, will draw you 3 or 4 cards on average. Sometimes you might only get 2. Sometimes you might get 8. So it's not the best turn 3 play. In fact, you should never play it on turn 3, and you should always get rid of it in the mulligan. But as a turn 5 or 6 play, that draws you maybe an Anoyotron and an Argent Squire to go with it that you can play immediately. It's really, really good. So it's another rare card. It's kind of expensive to craft. You won't use it all that often, so don't make this the first upgrade that you add to this deck. But anytime you play an aggressive or face Paladin deck, Divine Favor is going to be a staple in it. just to refill your hand and make sure that you can win games that last longer than 7 or 8 turns, because it's going to be hard to win games that last to turn 10 with this deck, unless you have a Divine Favor that kind of gives you a second wind and a reload option on all these cheaper minions. So those are my 3 immediate recommendations. Oh, and by the way, I'd get rid of Hammer of Wrath and swap in Divine Favor. Just get rid of that card draw. Hammer of Wrath is not the best card in this deck, so go ahead and swap in Divine Favor for it. So anyway, that wraps up the TGT budget Paladin deck, which I notice is very heavy in 4 drops, so don't look too hard at that curve, but it's a lot of good 4 mana minions with Paladin. But anyway, this is a pretty exciting deck to play. It can do a ton of cool stuff, and it's actually good enough as a budget and beginner deck to win games on the ranked ladder. So you won't be hitting Legend anytime soon, but you will be stringing together some win strings and climbing the ladder faster than you're probably used to so far. So I wish you luck with the budget Paladin. I encourage you to make changes as you see fit or ask any questions on this video. I'll be happy to make personal recommendations for you. Thanks for watching, and good luck out there with the TGT budget Paladin. Until next time, game on.